Composer, guitarist, singer, and bandleader Frank Zappa was a singular musical figure during a performing and recording career that lasted from the 1960s to the 1990s. His disparate influences included doo-wop music and avant-garde classical music. Although he led groups that could be called rock and roll bands for much of his career, he used them to create a hybrid style that bordered on jazz and complicated modern serious music, sometimes inducing orchestras to play along. As if his music were not challenging enough, he overlay it with highly satirical and sometimes abstractly humorous lyrics, and song titles that marked him as a coming out of a provocative literary tradition that included beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and edgy comedians like Lenny Bruce. Nominally, he was a popular musician, but his recordings rarely earned significant airplay or sales, yet he was able to gain control of his recorded work and issue it successfully through his own labels while also touring internationally, in part because of the respect he earned from a dedicated cult of fans and many serious musicians, and also because he was an articulate spokesman who promoted himself into a media star through extensive interviews he considered to be part of his creative effort, just like his music. The Mothers of Invention, the 60s group he led, often seemed to offer a parody of popular music in the counterculture. Although he affected long hair and jeans, Zappa was openly scornful of hippies and drug use. By the 1980s, he was testifying before Congress in opposition to censorship and editing his testimony into one of his albums. But these comic and serious sides were complementary, not contradictory. In statement and in practice, Zappa was an iconoclastic defender of the freest possible expression of ideas, and most of all, he was a composer far more ambitious than any other rock musician of his time, and most classical musicians as well. Zappa was born Frank Vincent Zappa in Baltimore, Maryland on December 21st, 1940. And for most of his life, he was under the mistaken impression that he had been named exactly after his father, a Sicilian immigrant who was a high school teacher at the time of his son's birth, and that he was Francis Vincent Zappa Jr. That was what he told interviewers, and it was extensively reported. It was only many years later that Frank examined his birth certificate and discovered that, in fact, his first name was Frank, not Francis. The real Francis Zappa took a job with the Navy during World War II, and he spent the rest of his career working in one capacity or another for the government or in the defense industry, resulting in many family moves. Zappa's mother, Rose Marie, was a former librarian and typist. During his early childhood, the family lived in Baltimore, Opelika, Florida, and Edgewood, Maryland. In December of 1951, they moved to California, when Frank's father took a job teaching metallurgy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. The same year, Zappa had first shown an interest in becoming a musician, joining the school band and playing the snare drum. Although the Zappa family continued to live in California for the rest of Zappa's childhood, they still moved frequently. By the time Zappa graduated from Antelope Valley Joint Union High School in Lancaster in June of 1958, it was the 7th high school he had attended. Meanwhile, his interest in music had grown. He'd become particularly attracted to R&B, joining a band as a drummer in 1955. Simultaneously, he had become a fan of avant-garde classical music. After his high school graduation, Zappa studied music at several local colleges off and on, and he also switched to playing the guitar. Frank married Catherine J. Sherman on December 28, 1960. The marriage ended in divorce in 1964. Meanwhile, he played in bands and worked on the scores of low-budget films. It was in seeking to record his score for one of these films, The World's Greatest Sinner, that he began working at the Tiny Pal recording studio in Cucamonga, California, run by Paul Buff, in November of 1961. He and Buff began writing and recording pop music with studio groups and licensing the results to such labels as Delphi Records and Original Sound Records. On August 1964, Zappa bought the studio from Buff and renamed it Studio Z. On March 26, 1965, he was arrested by a local undercover police officer who had entrapped him by asking him to record a pornographic audio tape. Convicted of a misdemeanor, he spent 10 days in jail, an experience that embittered him. After completing his sentence, he closed the studio, moved to Los Angeles, and joined a band called the Soul Giants that featured his friend singer Ray Collins, along with bass player Roy Estrada and drummer Jimmy Carl Black. In short order, he induced the group to play his original compositions instead of covers, and to change their name to Mothers, reportedly on Mother's Day, May 10, 1965. In Los Angeles, the Mothers were able to obtain a manager, Herb Cohen, and auditioned successfully to appear in popular nightclubs such as the Whiskey A Go-Go by the fall of 1965. There they were, seen by record executive Tom Wilson, who signed them to Verve Records, subsidiary of MGM Records, on March 1, 1966. Verve required that the suggestive name The Mothers be modified to The Mothers of Invention. The contract called for the group to submit 5 albums in 2 years, and they immediately went into the studio to record the first of those albums, Freak Out. By this time, Elliot Ingrid had joined the group on guitar, make a quintet. An excess of material and Zappa's agreement to accept a reduced publishing royalty led to the highly unusual decision to release it as a double LP, an unprecedented indulgence for a debut act that was practically unheard, much less for an established one. Freak Out was released on June 27, 1966. It was not an immediate success commercially, entered the Billboard chart for a week ending February 11, 1967, and eventually spent 23 weeks in the charts. In July of 1966, Zappa met Adelaide Gale Sloatman, and they married in September of 1967. Prior to the birth, on September 28, 67, of their first child, a daughter named Moon Unit Zappa, who would record with her father. She was followed by a son, Dweezil, on September 5, 1969, and he too would become a recording artist, as would Ahmet Zappa, born May 15, 1974. A fourth child, Diva, was born in August of 1979. During the summer of 1966, Zappa hired drummer Denny Bruce and keyboardist Don Preston, making the Mothers of Invention a septet. But by November 66, when the Mothers of Invention went back into the studio to record their second album, Absolutely Free, Bruce had been replaced by Billy Mundy, Ingber had been replaced by Jim Fielder, and Zappa had hired 2 horn players, Bunk Gardner on wind instruments and Jim Motorhead Sherwood on saxophone, bringing the band up to a 9-piece unit. The album was recorded in 4 days and released in June of 1967. It entered the charts in July and reached the top 50. The Mothers of Invention moved to New York City in November of 1966 for a booking at a Greenwich Village club called the Balloon Farm that began on Thanksgiving Day and ran through New Year's Day 1967. After a 2-week stint in Montreal, they returned to California, where Fielder left the group in February. In March, Zappa began recording his first solo album, Lumpy Gravy. Having signed to Capitol Records under the impression that he was not signed as an individual to Verve, a position Verve would later dispute. Later that month, the Mothers of Invention returned to New York City for another extended engagement at the Garrick Theater in Greenwich Village that ran during Easter week and was sufficiently successful that Herb Cohen booked the theater for the summer. That run began on May 24, 1967, and ran off and on through September 5th. During this period, Ian Underwood joined the band playing saxophone and piano. In August, the group began recording its third album, We're Only In It for the Money. In September of 1967, the Mothers of Invention toured Europe for the first time, playing in the UK, Sweden, and Denmark. On October 1st, Verve failed to exercise its own option to extend the band's contract, although they still owed the label 3 more LPs. They finished recording We're Only In It for the Money in October, but its release was held up because of legal concerns over its proposed cover photograph, an elaborate parody of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was finally resolved by putting the picture on the inside of the fold-out LP sleeve. We're Only in It for the Money was released on March 4th, 1968, and it reached the top 30. Another legal dispute was resolved when Verve purchased the tapes of Lumpy Gravy from Capitol. Zappa then finished recording his orchestral work, and Verve released it under his name on May 13, 1968. It spent 5 weeks in the charts. Although Mothers of Invention still owed one more LP to Verve, Zappa already was thinking ahead. In the fall of 1967, he began recording Uncle Meat, the soundtrack for a proposed film, with work continuing through February of '68. During this period, Billy Mundy left the band and was replaced on drums by Arthur Dyer Tripp III. In March, Zappa and Herb Cohen announced that they were setting up their own record label, Bizarre Records, to be distributed by the Reprise Records subsidiary of Warner Brothers Records. The label was intended to record not only Mothers of Invention, but also acts Zappa discovered. Early in the summer, Ray Collins quit the Mothers of Invention, who continued to tour. Their performance at the Royal Festival Hall in London on October 25, 1968 was released in '91 as the album Ahead of Their Time. That month, Bizarre was formally launched with the release of the single The Circle by Los Angeles street singer Wildman Fisher. In November, guitarist Lowell George joined the Mothers of Invention. In December, Verve released the band's final album on its contract Cruisin' with Reuben and the Jets, on which Zappa for once played it straight, leading the group through a set of apparently sincere doo-wop and R&B material. The LP spent 12 weeks in the charts. Zappa was then free of Verve, although his disputes with the company were not over. Verve put out a compilation, Mother Mania, The Best of the Mothers, in March of 1969, and it spent 9 weeks on the charts. The ambitious double LP Uncle Meat, the fifth Mothers of Invention album, was released by Bizarre on April 21st, 1969. It reached the top 50. The movie it was supposed to accompany did not appear until a home video release in 1989. In May, Bizarre released Pretty's For You, the debut album by Alice Cooper, the only act discovered by the label that would go on to substantial success after switching to Warner Brothers Record proper, that is. That same month, Lowell George left the band. Later, he and Roy Estrada would form Little Feat. Zappa began working on a second solo album, Hot Rats, in July of 1969. On August 19th, the Mothers of Invention gave their final performance in their original form, playing on Canadian TV at the end of a tour. 1 week later, Frank announced that he was breaking up the band, although as it turned out, this did not mean that he would not use the name, the Mothers of Invention, for groups he led in the future. Hot Rats, the second album to be credited to Frank Zappa, was released on October 10th, 1969. It spent only 6 weeks in the charts at the time, but it would become one of Zappa's best-loved collections, with the instrumental Peaches and Regalia a particular favorite. Although the Mothers of Invention no longer existed as a performing unit, Zappa possessed the extensive tapes of them live and in the studio, and using that material, he assembled a new album, Burnt Weenie Sandwich, released in February of 1970, and it made the top 100. At the invitation of Zubin Mehta, conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, Zappa assembled a new group of rock musicians dubbed the Mothers for the performance, with the orchestra of a work called 200 Motels at UCLA on May 15, 1970. Adding singers Howard Kalin and Mark Bullman, formerly of the Turtles, Zappa launched a tour with this version of the Mothers in June 1970. Also included were a returning Ian Underwood, keyboardist George Duke, drummer Ainsley Dunbar, and guitarist Jeff Simmons. In August, Bizarre released another archival Mothers of Invention album, Weasels Ripped My Flesh, which charted. Chunga's Revenge, released in October, was billed as Zappa's solo album. Even though it featured the current lineup of the Mothers, it spent 14 weeks in the chart. After touring the U.S. that fall, the group went to Europe on December 1st. From January 28th to February 5th, 1971, they were in Pinewood Studios in the UK, making a movie version of 200 Motels with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and co-stars Theodore Beichel, Ringo Starr, and Keith Moon of The Who. Zappa had planned a concert with the Royal Philharmonic at the Royal Albert Hall on February 8th as a money-saving tactic, since according to union rules he could then pay them for the filming recording session as if it were rehearsals for the concert. But this strategy backfired when the Royal Albert Hall canceled the concert, alleging that Zappa's lyrics were too vulgar. He added to his expenses by suing the Royal Albert Hall, eventually losing in court. On June 5th and 6th, 1971, the Mothers appeared during the closing week of the Fillmore East Theater in New York City, recording their shows for a live album, Fillmore East, June 71, quickly released on August 2nd. It became Zappa's first album to reach the top 40 since We're Only In It For The Money 3 years earlier. John Lennon and Yoko Ono had appeared as guests during the June 6th show, and they used their performance on their 72 album Sometime in New York City. The Mothers gave a concert at the Pauley Pavilion at UCLA on August 7th, 1971, and the show was recorded for the album Just Another Band from LA, released in May of 72, which made the top 100. They continued to tour into the fall. 200 Motels premiered movie theaters on October 29, 1971, with a double LP soundtrack album released by United Artists that made the top 100. Meanwhile, the Mothers' European tour was eventful, to say the least. On December 4, 1971, the group appeared at the Montreux Casino in Geneva, Switzerland, but their show stopped when a fan fired off a flare gun that set the venue on fire. The incident was inspiration for Deep Purple's song, Smoke on the Water. 6 days later, as the Mothers were performing at the Rainbow Theatre in London on December 10th, a deranged fan jumped on stage and pushed Zappa into the orchestra pit. He suffered a broken ankle, among other injuries, and was forced to recuperate for months. This was the end both of the tour and of this edition of the Mothers. While convalescing at home in Los Angeles, Zappa organized a new big band to play jazz fusion music. He dubbed it the Grand Wazoo Orchestra and recorded 2 albums with it. Waka Jawaka, billed as a Zappa solo album, came out in July of 72 and spent 7 weeks in the charts. The Grand Wazoo, credited to the Mothers, appeared in December and missed the charts. By September 10th, Zappa felt well enough to play 2 weeks of dates with the group, now billed as the Mothers, starting at the Hollywood Bowl. He then cut the personnel down to 10 pieces, the Petite Wazoo Band, and toured from late October to mid-December. The start of 1973 marked a new and surprisingly popular phase in Zappa's career. He assembled a new lineup of Mothers, made a batch of new recordings on which he himself sang lead vocals, and hit the road for the most extensive touring of his career, inaugurating the new band in Fayetteville, North Carolina on February 23rd. He spent 183 days of 1973 on the road, including tours of the U.S., Europe, and Australia. Meanwhile, the Bizarre Records deal with Reprise Warner had run out, and he launched a new label, also distributed by Warner, Discreet Records, its first release being Overnight Sensation in September of 73. The album reached the top 40, stayed in the charts nearly a year, and went gold. It was followed in April 1974 by a Zappa solo album, Apostrophe. Much to Zappa's surprise, radio stations began playing a track called Don't Eat the Yellow Snow. A single edit of the song actually spent several weeks in the lower reaches of the Hot 100, and Apostrophe peaked at number 10 for the week ending June 29, 1974, the highest chart position ever achieved by a Zappa album. That LP also went gold. Zappa continued to tour extensively in 1974. His next album, the double LP live collection Roxy and Elsewhere, credited to Zappa/Mothers, appeared in September 1974 and made the top 30. Adding his old friend Captain Beefheart to the band, he played shows at the Armadillo World headquarters in Austin, Texas on May 20th and 21st, 1975, that he recorded for the album Bongo Furry, credited to Frank Zappa/Captain Beefheart/The Mothers, released in October. It made the top 100. Prior to that had come One Size Fits All, credited to Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, released in June. It made the top 30. On September 17th and 18th, 1975, 2 concerts of Zappa's orchestral music were performed by a group dubbed the Abnukio's Emuka Electric Symphony Orchestra in memory of Lovey Gravy and conducted by Michael Zierot at Royce Hall, UCLA, and if I butchered that name, my apologies. The shows were recorded, but the material was not released until May of 1979 as the orchestral favorites, which spent several weeks in the charts. Starting on September 27, 1975, Zappa launched another extended period of touring, staying in the U.S. through a New Year's concert at the Forum in Los Angeles, then playing in Australia, Japan, and Europe, finishing on March 17, 1976. This ended another phase in his career. He split his longtime manager Herb Cohen and disbanded his group, which, because of legal disputes with Cohen, would turn out to have been the last one called the Mothers of Invention. Hereafter, he would perform and record simply as Frank Zappa. There were also other legal issues. In October 1976, he reached an out-of-court settlement in a suit he had waged against MGM/Verve that resulted in his winning the rights to the masters of his early albums. Zappa surprised fans when his name turned up as producer of a new album by Grand Funk Railroad, Good Singin', Good Playin', in August of 1976. In September, he launched his first world tour under his own name, playing in the U.S., the Far East, and Europe through February 1977. Zoot d'Allure, the last album to be credited to the Mothers, was released on Warner Brothers Records on October 29, 1976. The disc label apparently became claimed by Cohen. It reached the top 100. Zappa was also seeking to end his deal with Warner, and in March of 1977, he delivered 4 albums to the label simultaneously. The initial titles were Studio Tan, Hot Rats 3, Waka Jawaka, having counted as Hot Rats 2, Zappa's orchestral favorites, and the double album Live in New York, recorded in December of 1976. He demanded the 4 $60,000 advances the albums called for, and sued Warner for breach of contract when it did not pay. In the summer of 1977, he announced that he had concluded his contract with Warner, and he declared the 4 albums really constituted a single work called Leather, which he sold to Mercury Phonogram Records. Warner then sued to block its release. On September 8th of 1977, Zappa launched another North American tour, staying on the road until New Year's Eve. His shows from October 28th to the 31st at the Palladium in New York City were filmed and recorded, the material later emerging in the movie Baby Snakes. The European leg of the tour opened in London on January 24th, 1978. The resolutions of Zappa's legal disputes led to an unusually large number of releases over the next year. Zappa in New York, originally called Live in New York, was released on Discreet in March of 78 and made the top 100. Studio Tan appeared in 1978 in September and charted. Sleep Dirt, originally called Hot Rats 3, was released in January 79 and charted. Orchestral Favorites completed the releases of the material Zappa had delivered to Warner in March 1977. With these matters settled, Zappa launched Zappa Records, with distribution through Mercury Phonogram in the U.S. and CBS Records in the rest of the world, releasing the double LP Shake Your Booty on March 3rd, 1979. The album managed to distinguish itself from all other Zappa albums in the record bins and peaked at number 21, Zappa's best showing in 5 years, promoted by the single Dancin' Fool, which made the top 50. That track was nominated for a Grammy for Best Rock Vocal Performance by a Male, and Rat Tamago, another track on the album, got a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Instrumental Performance. Zappa toured Europe and Japan in the spring of 1979 and then returned to the U.S., where he completed work on his home studio called the Utility Muffin Research Kitchen on September 1st. The home studio and his continuing practice of recording his shows, along with greater control over his record releases, seemed to free Zappa to issue more records. Joe's Garage Act 1 was released in September of 79 and made the top 30. It followed in November by a double LP, Joe's Garage X 2 and 3, made the top 100. Baby Snakes, the film of the 1977 Halloween shows in New York, opened on December 21st, 1979. A soundtracked album did not appear until 1983. Zappa spent much of 1980 on the road, beginning a tour of North America and Europe on March 25th, with dates continuing through to July 3rd, and then touring again from October 10th through. Amazingly, Zappa did not release an album during 1980. A single, I Don't Want to Get Drafter, just missed making the Hot 100 in May, but he made up for that in 1980. In May, yet another new label, Barking Pumpkin Records, was launched with the release of a double LP, Tinseltown Rebellion, which made the top 100. By now, Zappa had perfected a method of melding studio and live performances on his records, such that the finished versions were a combination of the two. Also in May of 1981, he simultaneously released 3 instrumental albums via mail order: Shut Up and Play Your Guitar, Shut Up and Play Your Guitar Some More, and Return of the Son of the Shut Up and Play Your Guitar. In September came another album, You Are What You Is, and that made the top 100. Zappa's spring-summer tour of Europe in 1982 was plagued with problems, including canceled dates and even a riot at one show. After finishing the stint on July 14th, he did not tour again for 2 years. Meanwhile, on May 3rd, 1982, he released a new album, Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch, and it featured another one of his surprise hit singles as radio picked up on Valley Girl, a track featuring a vocal by his daughter, Moon Unit Zappa, imitating the character and employing the slang of a typical Southern California Valley Girl. The song peaked at number 32 on September 11th, 1982, making it the most successful single of Zappa's career. It was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Rock Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocal. The album made the top 30. After coming off the road, Zappa concentrated on recording and on his orchestral music. On January 11, 1983, conductor Kent Nagano led the London Symphony Orchestra in a concert of Zappa's works at the Barbican Arts Centre in London, preparatory to 3 days of recordings that resulted initially in an album, London Symphony Orchestra Volume 1, released in June of 1983. A second volume followed in September of 87. Prior to that, Zappa had released a new rock album, The Man from Utopia, on March 28, 1983, which charted for several weeks. As he had the year before, Zappa saw some of his orchestral music recorded in January of '84, this time by the Ensemble Intercontemporain of conductor Pierre Boulez. With other material, these recordings would be released by Angel Records on August 23, 1984, as Boulez conducts Zappa, The Perfect Stranger. The other material was Zappa's own recording on an advanced synthesizer instrument he had purchased called the Synclavier, capable of replicating orchestral arrangements. The Synclavier freed Zappa from the technical limitations and, in some cases, the objections of live musicians, especially classical musicians, and he turned to it increasingly from this point on. Having discovered manuscripts of music composed in the 18th century by an ancestor of his, Francesco Zappa, he recorded an album of it on the Synclavier in March of 1984, releasing the results on an LP called Francisco Zappa on November 21st, 1984. In July 18th, 1984, 2 years after the end of his last tour, Zappa went back on the road for an extensive worldwide trek that ran through December 23rd. On October 18th, he released a 2-LP set, Them or Us. A month later came the triple LP box set Thingfish on the same day as Francisco Zappa album. By this time, Zappa's records were no longer reaching the charts, as he focused on his existing fan base, heavily marketing them through mail order. Having reacquired the masters to his Verve MGM albums, he had found the tapes in dire condition and had re-recorded the bass and drum parts for the albums, We're Only In It For The Money and Cruisin' With Ruben and the Jets, which were part of a box set he offered to his mailing list. The Old Masters Box 1 in April of '85, the Old Masters Box 2 followed in '86, and the series was completed with the Old Masters Box 3 in '87. During the year of 1985, a group of wives of prominent politicians in Washington, D.C. formed the Parents Music Resource Center, or the PMRC, and lobbied Congress for restrictions on what they saw as obscenity in popular music. Zappa, long an opponent of censorship, became a leader of the opposition to the PMRC, and on September 19, 1985, he testified before the Senate Commerce, Technology, and Transportation Committee to voice his opinions. Of course, his testimony was a matter of public record, and he quickly used the recordings in an album he assembled called Frank Zappa Meets the Mothers of Prevention, released in November of '85. In January of '86, it became his 33rd and last album to reach the Billboard chart. In January of '86, the Zappa live album, drawn from the 1984 tour Does Humor Belong in Music?, was released in Europe, but quickly withdrawn. It was an accompaniment to a home video of the same name that was taken from the single date on the tour. The album was later reissued with a new mix. Meanwhile, Zappa signed a contract with the independent CD label Rykodisc to reissue his albums on CD. The reissue program was launched in the fall of that year. At the same time, Frank released a new instrumental album largely consisting of material recorded on the synclavier, Jazz from Hell. The album won him his first Grammy Award for Best Rock Instrumental Performance, Orchestra, Group, or Soloist, and the track Jazz from Hell itself earned a nomination for Best Instrumental Composition. On February 2, 1988, Zappa launched what would prove to be his final tour, playing 81 dates in North America and Europe through June 9th. Meanwhile, he continued to issue new recordings, and in April came a double album of guitar solos in the manner of Shut Up and Play Your Guitar series, simply called Guitar, and the first in a series of double CD archival live recordings, You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore, Volume 1. In typically unusual Zappa style, the series found him editing together live performances by different configurations of the Mothers and his backup bands at different times. By 1992, the series extended to 6 volumes. The second volume, which actually replicated a single concert performed in Helsinki in '74, appeared in October of '88 at the same time as an album of recordings from the '88 tour Broadway the Hard Way. Launching a home video line, Honker, in 1989, Zappa finally issued Uncle Meat on VHS tape along with the documentary The True Story of 200 Motels and the Video from Hell. The following year, Honker issued The Amazing Mr. Bickford, a documentary about the animator responsible for the clay animation work seen in Baby Snakes. In May 1989, Zappa published his autobiography, The Real Frank Zappa Book, co-authored with Peter Acciagrasso. And in another surprising non-musical career development in '89, Zappa began traveling to Russia as a business liaison. These efforts were extended in January of '90 when he went to Czechoslovakia, and where he met recently installed president and playwright and Zappa fan Václav Havel, and agreed to become a trade representative for the country. Understandably, this ran afoul of the administration of the American President George Bush, however, and Zappa's role became unofficial. It's hard to say what might have come of Zappa's trade efforts with the former Soviet Union and the former Iron Curtain countries where he was something of a cultural hero. In May of '90, he suddenly canceled scheduled appearances in Europe and returned to the U.S. due to illness. He managed to go to Czechoslovakia and Hungary in June of '91, however, but in the meantime, he continued to issue volumes of You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore series and albums drawn from the '88 tour. The Best Band You Never Heard in Your Life in April of '91, and Make a Jazz Noise Here in June of '91. In July of '91, in yet another unusual marketing move, he assembled a collection of 8 bootleg albums that had appeared over the years and offered his own version of them, mastered directly from the bootleg LPs themselves, as a box set called Beat the Boots. The albums were also released individually, and a second Beat the Boots box was released in June of '92. Zappa was scheduled to appear in New York for a performance by a group of alumni from his bands called Zappa's Universe on November 7th, '91, when he was unable to attend due to illness. His children explained publicly for the first time he was suffering from prostate cancer. He managed to fly to Germany on July 13th, '92 to work with the Ensemble Modern on a piece it had commissioned from him, The Yellow Shark. He was to present it for concerts. It performed in September, and in October, Zappa released Playground Psychotics, an archival album of previously unreleased material from the 1970-71 edition of Mothers. The Yellow Shark was released in November of 1993, and Zappa died, age 52, December 4th, 1993. After his death, his widow sold his existing catalog outright to Rykodisc. But like such well-established rock artists as the Grateful Dead, he had produced a tremendous archive of studio and live recordings that Gail Zappa was able to assemble into a posthumous albums for his legions of fans. The first of these was the ambitious Civilization Phase 3, which Zappa was working on in the period up to his death, released in December of '94, and other albums either containing concerts or other material have also appeared, along with expanded versions of previously released albums such as Freak Out. Decades after Zappa's death, the stream of releases showed no evidence of stopping, as long as Zappa's fans were interested in buying.